Hello, scholars. For this assignment, we'll exercise our creativity and use the writing process to write and revise a poem about an emotion. We'll take as our model the poem Lines Written During My Second Pandemic by Eduardo Corral. This is a terrific poem that's 14 lines, each with a different sort of metaphor or metaphoric language for loneliness. You can see it here at poets.org, which is linked in the assignment. If you read through this, there may be some lines that you don't quite understand, that maybe the image doesn't resonate with you, but some of them I think are quite effective. They give these really specific, vivid little details that are fresh, but also very relatable. So our first draft should look something like this. I'm looking for 14 lines. I'm looking for taking an emotion as the topic, and then I'm looking for a whole bunch of metaphors. And when I say metaphor, I mean metaphorical language. So simile, metaphor, something figurative, it's all good as long as we've got something fresh and insightful into this emotion. Before we start to draft a poem, we need to come up with some ideas that we can actually work with. We're going to do some pre-writing here. First, I'd like you to choose two emotions. You could choose two emotions that kind of are opposites, like happiness and sadness, or you could choose two emotions that kind of go together, like maybe fear and anxiety, if you think those are different enough that you can say something different about them. When you write the poem, you only need to write about one emotion, but you can write about two. In a traditional sonnet, you typically have a little shift at the end where the meaning of the poem kind of changes up. And you could create a mood shift in your poem by talking about two contrasting emotions. So you could start out by talking about fear and then shift to relief. Or you could start out talking about hate and then shift to love. Okay, regardless of whether you write your poem about one emotion or two emotions, I want you to do pre-writing for two emotions so that you have some options. So go ahead and choose two emotions, jot them down. I'm going to do mine here on fear and resentment. Now, before I do anything else, I could just pause for a moment and think about what it's like to feel each emotion. When I think about fear, I know there's multiple kinds of fear, right? There's that sort of jump scare you get where all your nerves just kind of like go into electric shock and you're filled with adrenaline. But there's also sort of a low grade fear that gnaws at you, like when you're expecting some kind of medical diagnosis or something and you're just kind of dreading it. So maybe we could call that dread or anxiety. But I think either one of those aspects of fear could be worth thinking about and writing about. Okay, when I think about them, I might be thinking, what does it feel like in my body? Again, I get that sort of adrenaline rush sometimes, or sometimes it just feels like there's something really heavy weighing me down that's kind of nagging on my mind. Sometimes I feel emotions sort of settle on you, almost like a flu or, like a cold where you just kind of feel a little bit achy everywhere. Other emotions I think are much lighter, much happier, much bouncier. Right. So take a moment and just think through what the emotion is like. Maybe jot down some ideas. Feel free to pause the video. Okay, and then come back and we'll do the next exercise. I'd like you to use lots of metaphors in this poem. And remember that a metaphor is comparing two things that are not the same, they're dissimilar, but through that comparison, you get some new insight. So, a way to create metaphors is just to generate a lot of comparisons that seem random, knowing that some of them are going to be bad, but that some of them might be really great and material that you can work with. So, go ahead and use the chart here. We're going to jot down our first emotion here. So, I'll write fear. And then our next emotion, I'm going to write down resentment. And then for each of these columns, I'd like you to go through and ask yourself, if fear were this, what would it be? If the emotion were this, what would it be? So I'm starting with fear. If it were a sound, what would it be? Well, again, think of that jump scare. It's kind of like the music in the movies where it sort of swells to that big crescendo. I'll put like crescendo swell there, gets really loud. Or it's kind of like a glass breaking, you hear that something drop and shattering, that sort of harsh sound that gets your nerves on edge. Or if I'm thinking about that sort of anxiety fear, that thing that just sort of nags at you, maybe it's like when someone next to you has their headphones in and you can like sort of hear the music, but it just sounds really tinny and bad and you can't make out the words and it just kind of nags at you a little bit. Okay, so I'll put here tinny music from someone else's headphones. I cannot type, man. My fingers are like sausages or something on the keys here. Painful to watch. Okay, if fear were a color, what would it be? Now, in this case, nothing particularly comes to mind, so it's okay if you got somewhere you just jot something down that you're like, well, I'm probably not going to use this. But maybe I'm thinking with fear, something sort of dark. Maybe if you think about the sky when there's like, it gets that dark blue, purple right before a storm comes in. That might be an idea I could work with. Okay, next. If fear were fabric or an item of clothing, what would it be? I could be thinking about textures here. Is it something that's very rough, very scratchy? Or I could think about clothes, how you wear them. Is it something comfortable to put on? Is it something that's too tight, that kind of is oppressively sucking you in or itching at you like a wool sweater? I'm thinking, maybe this will sound cliche, but when you get that really tight, clenched up feeling, I think it's like being a little bit like being in a straitjacket. Although, be honest, I've never been in a straitjacket. Hope I never will be either. Hope I'm not that crazy, right? Okay. If fear were a physical action, what it would be? Well, I think that sort of gut punch sensation you get sort of relates, like, the big jump scare fear is like that gut punch. So maybe I'll write down here. I'll just put a gut punch. But I think if I'm thinking about the low level anxiety, maybe that's just sort of a repeated pressure, as if someone were just repeatedly running their fingernail over your skin in the same spot over and over until eventually it just feels super, super irritated. So maybe I'll put repeated, I don't know, light scratch in the same spot. For your emotions, go through this list, do the same thing. Say, if my emotion were this, what would it be? And jot down some ideas. It's okay if they're bad, but some of them hopefully will end up being pretty good, and you have some material to work with. But this will be a great way to generate some metaphors. Down here at the bottom, I've got space for you to put your own choice of things in. So if you like hair, put hairstyle. If fear were a hairstyle, what would it be? I don't know about fear, but I know about happiness. I'm pretty sure it's a Dolly Parton blonde, sort of bouffant, light and fluffy and gorgeous. Okay, if you like musical instruments, for example, you could say if it were a musical instrument, what would it be? Are we talking a timpani, a cello, a flute? Okay, if you like sports, you might think if it were a moment in a sports game, what would it be? Okay, is it that moment where you slide the hoop through the net? Or is it that moment where, you see that baseball flying at you and it's going to hit you in the face? Okay, whatever relates to you, you can put them down for your choice things here at the end, and then use that again to generate some ideas for your emotion. So work through this exercise and then come back and let's talk about drafting the assignment. Once you've generated some ideas, it's time to start writing. Now, don't be intimidated by writing a poem. Remember, there are many, many poetic forms. Some rhyme, some don't, some have meters, some don't. For this poem, it's okay to write free verse, which means you don't need to rhyme and you don't need to keep a particular rhythm. You can take Eduardo Corral's poem as a model. Remember, each line is basically just a sentence, except it's a sentence that's got some really interesting little images and ideas in it. So I've given you two options for writing your first draft. One is to use the template that I've provided here based on Eduardo Corral's poem. Okay, if you use this template, remember that it's very, very flexible. Okay, any word that's on here you can change to make match, and if there's something you don't like, cross it out. But you want to look back at your list and find your best ideas and then start working them in where you feel they belong in those sentences. If you do that, you'll end up with some different sentence structures and, again, a relatively decent first draft. The other option is just to write from scratch, and I've given you just some blank lines to do that with. So let me think what that might look like with my pre-writing here. Let's say I want to go with this idea of resentment, that it's this nagging voice, like it's something that's like, you shouldn't feel this way, but you do feel that way, right? Like a little bit of anger, a little bit of jealousy, just at a sort of low-grade fever level. Okay, so maybe I'll take that and turn it into a line. I'll say, resentment nags, or resentment is a nagging voice preaching right and wrong without telling me how to change. Sometimes it's hard to change when you feel resentment. Or maybe I go to this dirty yellow gray and I think, what would that be? Resentment throws a dirty yellow gray tarp over the happiness I should be feeling. Again, sometimes you should feel happy for someone, or you should be happy about something someone did, but you just have that resentment and it just sort of smothers it. Okay, maybe I think about this idea of something that's kind of unpleasant, that pinches you, like it's not something that's just so incredibly painful that you need to change, but it, like that nagging voice, that nagging feeling. So maybe I say, resentment pinches like too tight shoes that eventually bruise your feet. So again, I'm just going to go through my list, find the ones I like. I'm going to make these into sentences that have some kind of image or some kind of metaphor related to the emotion. And hopefully I'll come up with some stuff that's really specific and fresh, but that my reader can also relate to, because, we're humans, we all feel the same emotions. I am 100% in favor of embracing the crappy first draft. When you're getting words on the page, it's okay if they're terrible. You can always make them better. But if you get crappy words on the page and you stop there, well, then you have a crappy draft. So revision is a super important step in the writing process. Okay, when we revise, we're literally re-seeing our writing. We're looking at it and saying what works, what doesn't work, who am I writing this for, what do they need, how can I change it, how can I make this more effective. Now we can use this handy little acronym here to think about just some of the basic moves we make while revising. So the first thing we might do is replace things. So if I have a word that I don't like, I can swap it out for a better one. If I have an example I don't like, I can swap it out for a better one. Now, as we're going through, we might find places where what we said is a little incomplete or where an addition of a detail could strengthen it. So our second letter there is add. Our D is delete. Okay, we're going to take away the stuff that doesn't work. And remember the words of Stephen King, right? Second draft equals first draft minus 10%. Although I think that's true for people who like to write. For people who don't like to write, maybe you need to add 10%. Okay, and then finally we can rearrange. We can look at the parts and see what works, what doesn't work. Now, one thing you can also do while you revise is just to start over. So if it's terrible and you don't like it, well, then start from scratch. That's okay, especially with something short like this. For this poem in particular, here are some suggestions that I think might be helpful. The first thing would be to look at your verbs. The verb is like the most important part of a sentence most of the time. And if you've got a really boring verb or a verb that's not quite right, just swapping that out for a verb with a little more energy or a little more specificity can go a long way. The next is when you think about your language here, you're using it to make little images in people's mind, almost like little photographs in their mind. And if you get a little more specific or concrete with those images, then you're creating little better pictures for people to put in their mind to go along with what you're saying. Now, with poetry, just like with a painter, they use paint to make art, or with a sculptor, you use clay to make art. Okay, poets use words to make art. And so you can use the words itself, and that's the sound of words, whether they've got hard sounds with like a hard K or an oo or a s. Like all those sounds can be put together in ways that create particular effects. You can use line breaks, you can use punctuation for effect. Again, all these are little tools in your palette, just as if you're an artist painting a picture. And in poetry, which is all about doing special things with the language, like that is all fair game. Of course, one good thing to do is just sit with the emotion for a moment, think about what the experience of it is like, and then go from there. I'll show you here my first draft and my first revision that I did. The first one I used Eduardo Corral's poem just as a sort of template, and I wrote something about fear. I'm not in love with that I wrote. It's not terrible, but I don't think it's all that great. But that's okay. It's a first draft. Okay, then I went through and wrote a second draft here, and I made several changes. I did all of the things on our list there. So I replaced, I added, I deleted, and I rearranged. And I'm much happier with my second draft here. So let me just show you some specific changes I made. My first line, I have all nerves turned toward fear. I was thinking of this idea where you have that sort of jump scare and like everything in your body seems like it's on high alert. Well, I wanted something that had a little more energy than turn, so I added swivel. I think that feels a little faster and gives a little more of the impression that you're sort of alert to whatever the direction the thing that's threatening you is coming from. Okay, when I was looking through my poem, I had two lines, this one about nerves, and then I had another one, where is it? Somewhere in here, about neurons. And I thought, well, those two go together. So I pulled this line up, so it's right here. So in my revision, I've got neurons arc in my spine. And of course, then I was thinking about what electricity does in your body. It's kind of like that's what turns you on, right? It's what makes everything work, almost like a car turning on. So I just added that little detail in there. Now, as I looked through my first draft, I had two lines that were almost the same, so I deleted one. And then I changed some of the lines so that they weren't end-stopped. Okay, an end-stopped line is a line where the end of the line ends on a punctuation mark or a period, so there's a pause built in right at the end of the line. But poetry doesn't have to use end-stop lines. You can enjam lines, which means you break your sentence halfway or partway through, and that can create some nice effects. It can make it sound a little more like speech, or it can isolate particular images and give each little image its own moment on the page. Or it can kind of mess with your expectations where you read the first part of the sentence and you think it means one thing, and then you skip to that, go to the next line, and it means something different. At any rate, I added a little bit more breaks in the lines so they weren't all end stopped, which I think helped the rhythm. Okay, I made a couple other changes in here. Again, I'm happy with the changes I made. It's a better draft. So first revision, you're going to go through, tinker with what you have, and I expect to see Some replacement, some addition, some deletion, some rearranging. Okay, just go line by line and say, do I like this line or can I make it better? Do I like this line? Can I make it better? Do I like this line? Can I make it better? Once you've finished your second draft, first revision, I'd like you to revise one more time. In a craft talk given for Stokes Center for Creative Writing, Eduardo Corral talks about pouring language into new containers as part of his revision process, and he says that he will do 8 or 9 drafts of a poem before he's close to being satisfied or ready to think about sort of publishing it. Now, if you think what we mean by pouring language into new containers, it's basically taking your ideas, your content, if you will, and rewriting that in a different sort of poetic form. So he said if he writes his first draft and he uses couplets, which are 2 lines that go together, then maybe for his next draft he'll write in tercets, which are 3 lines that go together. And by forcing yourself to make some really big changes by putting the poem into a different form, you may come up with some really interesting insights or revelations that lead you to a poem that's much closer to what you want to say, that you're happy with. Now, you may not like the changes you make in this case, and that's okay, but you don't know until you've tried. So for this revision, we're not just tinkering with our poem, we're going to make some radically big changes by shifting up the form of the poem. On the handout I've given you, I've got some options for you to look at. So there's the pantoum, the triolet, the haiku. I put the haiku in there as a short one, although I assume you've probably done those before. I've also linked to a list with several different poetic forms, and you can look through this list and find some really interesting and fun ones. You might try the golden shovel. That's a good one. And you'll see some examples there for each of those. I did this myself. I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom. Just using Corral's poem sort of as a model, I wrote a poem here about resentment, just the sort of nagging feeling you have when you should be happy about something someone did for you, but instead you just kind of like are low grade angry at them for whatever past wrongs they've done you. It's based on his poem in the sense that I've got these different images that don't relate. So they're all about resentment, but they don't have something that's like an overarching connecting theme beyond that. Anyway, I'm reasonably happy with some of these. I think some of them sort of convey the way that I feel when I feel resentment, which is it's not a pleasant feeling. It's kind of like a feeling of being sick, like you've got a little bit of a fever, a little bit of an ache, like the flu is starting. And it feels like you swallowed a little bit of poison. It's like you don't want it, but sometimes it's hard to stop the emotion when you have it. Okay, so I thought I'm going to try this in a different form, and I tried the pantoum form, and I'm not doing the rhyme scheme and I'm not doing the rhythm. All I'm doing here is just playing with the repetition of lines. I read a poem recently where the poet had used this form with no rhyme scheme, but just again repeating certain lines with little variations, and I thought it was quite lovely. So I took the idea here of this resentment feeling sort of like a poison or sort of feeling like a disease that settles in on you. And I thought, okay, that's the line I'm going to go with. So I took the line right here, the old familiar disease settles back in, and I made that the first line of my poem. And then I went through and I'm just doing the repetitions here. And I've come up with something that it's very different from what I had before. What I have on the screen right now is a very, very rough draft. I think it's got potential, but it's by no means finished. I'd have to keep working with it. But it is kind of a new direction that I like, that might be fun to work with. Well, fun in the sense that you're talking about something that's kind of a depressing feeling, but something that I think could turn into something nice. So anyway, really great exercise, great way to get some different insights and to just try something new, to play with language a little bit. Okay, so summing up the process here, picked an emotion, did some pre-writing, just some idea generating, wrote a first draft. Maybe it was crappy. That's okay. We embrace the crappy first draft, but then we revise. Did a first revision where you took your draft and tinkered with it by adding, deleting, rearranging, replacing. And then wrote a different draft which had the same ideas, maybe even some of the same lines, but that had very different form and should look very different from your second draft. At that point, read back through, see which one you like the best, and just write me a couple lines of reflection about what you got from this process of writing. And let me just say, I really believe we talk about the writing process, this idea of making a plan and then putting some words on the page and then working with those words to make them better. Like, it really works. That's the way to write something that you feel good about, that you want to communicate with other people, that's worth sharing. And it's a great way to explore what you actually mean, or what you actually think, what you actually feel. All right, happy writing.